happening all across our region, and just how we can start to think about solutions to climate change with an equity and whole systems approach. We're looking at the intersectionality of that. A lot of my material does have some King County specific data, but I also recognize that many of you are working across the entire state, and that there are a lot of great movements and work happening in other areas of the state. So I primarily provide this just as kind of a context, and then you can apply that to where you are. I have, oh my, it says I have 90 slides, but I really don't. So a little bit about where I'm going to go with this. I want to kind of talk about the historical context to the places we're in, and then some examples of how we have seen community drive action in these places that have that intersectional approach. And I put this quote here from the King County Strategic Climate Action Plan. There was a new climate justice section that I led. And this is from one of our community members that said, you know, a lot of the things that our communities have already been asking for, like healthy food, good transportation, living wage jobs, and affordable housing, all of these basic needs that communities have been advocating for decades, are also climate resilience strategies and also carbon emissions and reduction strategies. When we're meeting people's basic needs and when we're planning for people to be healthy and helping them become climate resilient, we can actually help to reduce carbon emissions too. And I just love that quote because I feel like it really embodies the ways that we need to be looking at these things from multiple perspectives, and that we really can have things that support our communities and also address climate change. I always start my presentations with a little bit of where I come from, why I care about these issues, because every single one of us has a climate story to tell. All of us have talked about the why we care about these issues. And part of this is, you know, the Yale Center for Climate Communications does a survey every year of people's attitudes towards climate change. And one of the metrics that is thankfully steadily going up is that they believe climate change is real and believe the science. That number steadily going up. But one of the things that has been below 50%, it has been I think climate change directly impacts me. And the more we can normalize stories of, oh yeah, I see how this impacts my lived daily experience, my life, the people I know, the more that we can help mobilize folks to take action around this. So I grew up in Hawaii and I've been in Washington for about 17 years. So both places are home for me. And these are some pictures from how climate change is directly impacting where my family lives. And the picture on the top right is from 2015. And this is the first time we had 3 Category 3 or higher hurricanes that were within days of each other. So you'll notice in between the first and second storm, super tiny, are the Hawaiian Islands, and each storm is larger than the entire state. And this is the case where, imagine if you were hit by a devastating hurricane and then a couple days later hit by another one, and a couple days later hit by another one. And with warming oceans, we've seen the intensity of hurricanes go up, and we've had bigger, stronger storms. And in the middle picture, this is a waterfall that's outside of Hilo on the Big Island where I have some family. And that's what the waterfall normally looks like. And on the right is what that same waterfall looked like in 2018 when Hurricane Lane passed, which was the first Category 5 hurricane to get that close to the islands. It thankfully was a side swipe and not a direct hit, but it dropped about 4 feet of rain in 48 hours. And even in the last few weeks, Hawaii's been hit with some pretty intense rain lately and flooding. And at a rate of about 4 inches an hour. So there's just an immense amount of change that's happening that is disproportionately impacting different areas of the world, right? We also get everything shipped in. So imagine every time there's a hurricane warning and there is potential impact, the ports shut down. So if you're trying to get access to medical supplies or food, or at this time of year, we get all the Christmas trees shipped in from Washington. So the other thing is, I mean, we were used to runs on toilet paper way before COVID, because that was always the first thing to go whenever there was a storm warning. And we're also losing land literally into the ocean. So that's a picture on the bottom left. And during our king tides, which is the top left, there's actually the sea level is rising to a point where we're getting fish swimming in the streets. That's actually little tiny fish in the sidewalk. Of course, now I live in Washington, and one of my early jobs, I was running a youth program in the Chinatown International District in the Seattle area. And I show this picture because the high school students I was working with were folks that, were working on issues like air quality. And we partnered to address the fact that the neighborhood was surrounded by freeway on two sides, and then a major road, the freight system. There was the big Amtrak and freight rails were right next to it. There was a bus tunnel. There's an incredible amount of pollution on all sides. And we also looked at how are those things exacerbated and who gets to participate in some of those projects. So the picture on the right is Hinghe Park. And that was one of the only, there was only like 2 public parks that are in the neighborhood. And this one has like 2 or 3 trees. There's no green space. There's no, and this is a neighborhood that disproportionately doesn't have green space. It has poor air quality. And then when you have a really hot heat wave come through, it's just reflecting off of all of the pavement. So there was a plan to expand the park, and our youth participated in the expansion plans and would show up to the public meetings. And, we mobilized our elders. We did walking groups to make sure they got home safely after public meetings. And then we saw the final design and we were like, wait, that looks exactly the same as when we first started showing up. What happened? And I asked our youth at the end, like, do you feel like the adults listened to you? Do you feel like decision makers took into account your ideas? And I was heartbroken because so many of our young people said, I don't know why we participate in these things if they're not going to listen to us anyway. And that for me was a mobilizing moment of, I need to be working upstream. I need to be making sure that we have a voice at the table, that our young people have a voice at the table, and that we are actually creating solutions that come from those that are disproportionately impacted. So in Washington State, and I'm not going to go over like how does climate change work and like and all of that, because I'm assuming most of the folks here already have that background. But if you do want resources around that, I also have a whole other thing for folks where it might be a newer concept for them. Everything from how do you account greenhouse gases to how do you explain the greenhouse gas effect. So feel free to reach out if you want those resources. In Washington, obviously, we've seen our fair share of climate impacts as well. There's sometimes this notion that, oh, we're not as bad as these other places, or we're not as bad as, at least we're not getting, a Hurricane Katrina, or we're not getting, but the reality is that we are seeing some pretty significant impacts, and it's about how prepared we are for them and who is impacted by those things. So in the case of, heat waves, we had some of the lowest rates of air conditioning of a major metropolitan area in the entire country. So when you start getting temperatures into the 90s and houses that were never built for hot temperatures, you're going to have disproportionate impact, right? We have a huge agricultural industry in Washington State, and so many of our farm workers and folks who have to be outside during those heat waves or during our, unfortunately now, wildfire season, the wildfire smoke. So thinking about who is exposed to these things, what are the conditions, who has to be outside because of those choices, right? And then you throw on the COVID pandemic, and there's been some evidence that exposure to wildfire smoke and to chronic exposure to PM 2.5, which I'll talk about later, can actually increase your risk of COVID mortality. So I'm going to talk about some depressing things at first, but I promise I will end optimistic. And I do want to recognize, especially for the work groups that are working on mental health, that COVID or that climate anxiety and climate grief is totally a real thing. There is a whole field of study all about that, because it is something that that impacts all of us, and especially our young folks. I did a workshop for high school students a couple summers ago. And when I asked this question in all of the workshops I've done, which is, you know, what is one of the climate issues that you care about the most, that you are most concerned about? And when I did it with adults, it was like, oh, air quality or renewable energy or health impacts, or you know, it was always like a specific issue. And when I did this with some high school students, I had done these poster papers around the wall, and I had kind of wandered around to check on each group. When I came back to this question on the wall, there was no one standing at it, but there was some writing on it, and it said, "The end of the world and death." And that was also the other turning point for me of wanting to give our folks hope, give our communities hope, give our young people hope, right? And so I bring that up as just one of the many pieces to this whole puzzle. This graphic, which I recognize the print is tiny, but this is from the King County Strategic Climate Action Plan that I helped author. And it talks about everything from not just the environmental changes we'll see from climate change, but also the health impacts, the ecosystem impacts, the built environment impacts, and all the ways that we're going to see that kind of ripple across all of our communities. Next. And then we're talking about Washington, and I've talked about Hawaii, but we recognize that none of us are an island except for Hawaii, obviously. But literally, our ecosystems, our economies, our the way that we function, we are part of a global community, right? That climate change is happening across the world, and what's happening in other parts of the world matter to us. That, you know, we have an incredible amount of our food that is shipped into the United States. We have, you know, there have been conflicts that have resulted in forced migration and refugees that are having, and so it's become a migration thing too. There's been chronic drought in some areas of the world. We're seeing huge wildfires. Australia had record wildfires in the last few years. And then we also have some countries that are ceasing to exist. Their land is literally falling into the ocean. And there's some Pacific islands who've actually had to work out deals with New Zealand and Australia for when their islands are gone to be able to move there. And this also has impact to Washington, because we have a significant immigrant and refugee community here that have connections to a lot of these places, have family members that are still there. And I do a lot of work with the Pacific Islander community here, and I was working with a couple of Samoan friends, and one of them said to me, you know, what does it mean when, you know, we've had to move to Washington, and now several generations later, our children are not even going to understand the origins of our stories, of our cultural traditions, because they won't know the land where that came from. So there's a deep part of cultural grief here too. This is like, there's been a ton of work out there specifically around climate change and health. And so if you want resources for that, I encourage you to look at the CDC has a whole bunch of resources. But this has everything from water quality to heat to changes in vector-borne diseases, which is diseases that are carried by things like mosquitoes. Mosquito ranges are actually changing. So you'll see diseases that weren't in other places now kind of migrating farther and farther away from the tropics. We talked about forced migration, heat-related illnesses, and severe weather. So there's a lot of impacts here. All of this though happens within a context, right? Like, and I think it's important to note that there are a lot of other root causes to who experiences climate change disproportionately. And so, so one of the things that we often say is that climate change is a threat multiplier. It's the thing that's going to make existing inequities worse. So if you already are low income, if you already have health conditions, if you already don't have stable housing, if you already have don't have great access to healthy foods, right? If you already have struggling to pay your heat bill, right? And so some of the things on here are everything from poverty to income inequality to racial segregation, political disenfranchisement, access to democracy and decision makers, and then kind of the social factors of everything from affordable housing, green spaces. What languages do you speak? And does that mean, do you speak English and have a way to access things that are not in your, that are in other languages? What kind of community do you have around you, the social cohesion of that community? If there's a climate disaster of some sort, are you able to turn to your neighbor and ask for help? Or have you been displaced and have to move farther away from those communities for housing costs, and then no one around you speaks your language, right? So there's a lot of different factors. And then there's actual like biological factors of age, illness, mental health, overall health status, all those things. So I want to talk a little bit about like the work we did in Seattle King County about thinking about the context, right? So that kind of root causes, context, and place really mattering, right? And in this case, I want to go back, way back to what Seattle looked like prior to colonization, right? So in the middle picture, it's a picture of the Duwamish River as it originally was. It was a meandering river, had a lot of sediment transport out to the mudflats, and the mudflats had tons of shellfish, and it was a place for the Duwamish tribe and the Duwamish people. That was their ancestral lands. And at the time when there were settlers came in, their downtown Seattle was literally transformed, and the Duwamish River was transformed. And so the picture on the bottom left is the taking high pressured water hoses and blasting them down to fill in the mud flats, which is where downtown Seattle is now. So there used to be these sea cliffs, and then they filled in the mud flats and built on top of it. So that's also why downtown is earthquake prone, because it's all fill soil. So when there's an earthquake, it liquefies. And so the history of how the land was treated and you know, the Duwamish River was, you know, a lot of the industry was on that, and that was pre-EPA, pre-Clean Air Act, pre-Clean Water Act. And so back then the solution to pollution was dilution. And this is also before we knew a lot of the impacts of a lot of this stuff, right? The science hadn't quite caught up yet. And in this case, it was, well, if we just diluted enough in the water, and that's why there are now Superfund sites there, right? The other issue is, you know, down in Tacoma, there was the Arsenco plant, which is a aluminum manufacturing plant, and their solution to pollution was dilution. So they're like, if we build a tall enough smokestack, then it'll all kind of like spread out and it'll be fine, which is also why a lot of South King County, those particles were carried up, and there's now arsenic in a lot of the soil in South King County. So you'll often say, like, don't plant your garden in that soil, make sure you bring in soil, right? So it's important for us to think about, how was that land used and transformed in the past? What were the factors that went into that? What used to be in those spaces? This was also one of the first displacements in this area where the native folks were not allowed within the city limits. They were kicked out of the city of Seattle. And to this day, the Duwamish tribe doesn't have federal recognition or a treaty. The other thing that kind of influences literally where people live and how that impacted that impacts your health too is the history of redlining and racial covenants. So there was a practice back in the day of you wouldn't get lent to be able to buy your house. Banks would actually categorize different areas of the city into red, yellow, or green. So desirable and then hazardous was the red. And it was almost exclusively communities of color that were labeled as the red and hazardous. And so if you were a Black person trying to get a loan for a house, they would steer you towards the red areas and not lend you in the blue. And then if you're a white family, they would not lend you if you were in the red. And then there were also racially restrictive covenants that were actually written into the deeds of properties that said that you couldn't sell it, own it, lease it. People couldn't live there if you were not white. And so there's a few examples. This is all over King County. So this is some examples of different cities. It predominantly happened up in the north end, but it was actually all over the county. And this practice was something that happened all over the country. So you can find examples of this in almost every major city across the United States. So you can look up all of that. These particular ones I pulled are from the University of Washington has a project where they're actually doing the research to track down all of the racially restrictive covenants. And they have a cool interactive map, and you can look up specific neighborhoods too. But that has a lasting legacy and impact, right? If over post-GI Bill and after World War II, there was a significant amount of federal resources that were shifted towards home ownership and being able to help people coming back from the war to be able to buy their first home. Over 90% of those loans, 95% of those loans went to white veterans, even though there was a significant number of veterans of color. And that had a lasting legacy that, combined with the practice of redlining and racially restrictive covenants, meant that who was able to accumulate generational wealth and who was able to buy a home, have access to the equity in that home, be able to use that to pass on to their kids, maybe help them pay for college, maybe help them start their first business, right? Like that has a long lasting legacy. And the thing is that a lot of this wasn't that long ago. And so we are still dealing with some of the lasting impacts of some of this. So this is actually Seattle specific data, because I was looking at that map, looking at home ownership rates and how they're dramatically lower, especially for Black and Latino families. This data is from the 2010 census. I tried to find the 2020 census stuff, and I think they haven't made all the maps yet based on the new data. So I'm if anyone has found that, let me know. I just don't trust my own GIS skills enough for that. So this is some just looking at King County and Seattle, how the lasting legacy of some of these policies has actually resulted in the same areas. There's a kind of a correlation between the same areas that were historically redlined and where we're seeing communities of color and poverty and other health disparities disproportionately land. So this is looking at poverty. This is primarily looking at where our immigrants and refugees are settling, two different areas, primarily South Seattle, but then also in the tech hub. So there's kind of two different areas there. Looking at where people of color live, we have an incredibly diverse area in comparison to the rest of the United States. And then where English is spoken less than very well. And then these are indexes looking at median income on the left. And then on the right is looking at a combination of a whole bunch of those different factors. So looking at everything from obesity and diabetes to mental illness to poverty to life expectancy, employment access, and they kind of put that all into one index to look at where do all those factors coalesce together. And you'll see primarily South Seattle, South King County. And there's actually now a 10-year life expectancy difference between North King County and South King County. And then we're looking at health disparities. So this is looking at all of those factors kind of coming together in one thing. On the right is from the environmental health disparities map. So this is a statewide map. So if you want to look it up, you can find this and zoom into your community and your area. It does a ranked index of all of these different environmental exposures, health impacts, and you can actually click on individual in things, everything from looking at PM 2.5 to diesel exposure to health outcomes, and you can kind of like do it whatever scale you want. So I clipped this to King County, but you can look at your own community in Washington on this. And this is being used by the state for the Environmental Justice Council will be using it. The HEAL Act just passed, which is the Healthy Environments for All, which requires state agencies to incorporate environmental justice. So this is going to have a lot of impact across our statewide policy too. I talked a little bit about air quality, and so this is something that's impacting all of us across the state. This is from last year. I did a little screenshot of what it looked like across the state. Eastern Washington definitely got hit really hard with that. There was some discussion anecdotally, we were talking about like, wow, they got to up that scale because y'all were dark purple, beyond dark purple range on some of these numbers. And the reason this is, they measure PM 2.5, right, is that's actually the smallest particulate matter. That's what PM stands for. And it's so small that it is smaller than the 10th of the width of a human hair. And what happens when you breathe that in is that it's so small, it actually will pass through your lungs into your bloodstream. So it's not just for those that have respiratory issues, but those that have heart conditions, those that have high blood pressure, those that have diabetes, also being at higher risk for this. So thinking about folks who work outside, those who have to be outside for their jobs, those that and then like not everyone's lungs are the same too. So our very young people and our very elderly also being disproportionately impacted by that. There's also been changes to our pollen and allergy seasons. I don't know if any of you have had your allergies change over the last 10 years or so, but I used to not have allergies and now I do 5 years later. So and I've also known anecdotally from folks who've said like, yeah, my allergies started way earlier than they normally do. And that's because as we're warming, things are flowering earlier, we're having more intense pollen seasons. So a lot of different factors going into this. Another climate impact we're going to see is higher heat days. So one of the things we did, this happened in Tacoma as well, where we did a study to actually look at microclimates of how heat is experienced. And the big thing is how heat is actually retained overnight, because that impacts sleep patterns and other health outcomes in that way. And so this report is also available online. This is looking at a snapshot of the highest heat day in 2019. And that middle is the actual map. It's interesting because the eastern side was actually just as hot in many places, if not hotter, during the middle of the day, but by the evening had cooled off significantly. So this has factors into how we build our built environment. Where does our paved areas go? Where does trees go? Where do green space go? When we build new buildings, who are we designing that to be able to have better airflow and better ways to lose heat during our hot days, but retain heat during the winters? What does that mean for energy efficiency? We don't necessarily want everyone to be getting air conditioners because that actually contributes to climate change. But there has to be other ways that we are approaching it from all these different spectrums, right? Transit access is also another issue that comes up, right? We want people to have access to public transit as a climate solution to be able to get folks out of their cars, but not everyone has equal access to this. There are some parts of our state that do not have public transit access, right? And this is looking again just at King County, but this is all applicable to the entire state. And looking at where that need is disproportionately fallen. And you'll notice a trend here. Wow, it seems like South Seattle, South King County keep popping up as like these areas, right? So you start to think about the cumulative impact of all of these different issue areas, right? I talked about this a little earlier where we were talking about cultural loss. A lot of our tribes in Washington are also having to deal with this too, of like not just salmon populations, but also access to traditional foods and species that are also struggling to adapt to these heat waves and drought in the summer and increased rainfall in the winter. And you know, huckleberries that used to grow at this elevation might actually be changing range, might actually be moving farther up. And then I know some of our tribes out on the Olympic coast, I think it was Quinault that had to actually move their traditional village because of sea level rise and being able to have to move it up the cliff, right? What I love about the way that they approached it, though, is they were like, how can we do this in a way that is relevant to our values in our community? So they actually moved all the children and elders first, and then the tribal admin building was the last thing they moved, because they were like, how do we do this in accordance with our values? All of this to say that environmental racism is a real thing. It's happening all over the world, all over the country. And that people of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted. We often use the phrase frontline communities, which are those who are on the front lines of climate change, who are going to be impacted first and worse, who have experienced the legacy of historic and current inequities, and who have limited capacity to adapt, limited capacity resources to adapt, right? There is this fear too within the community around what folks are now calling climate apartheid, of like, we're going to end up in a situation where there will be those that can adapt and survive and those who don't. And that's definitely not where we want to end up, right? And I'm being mindful of time, Maddie, I noticed. So I really wanted to end on, what are things like, okay, this is a massive problem. It can be really depressing. We don't want to end up on that note. So I wanted to talk about how little things have big impact, and that community leaders have a big impact. You all have a big impact in being able to mobilize change, and mobilize change actually quicker than you might think too. So we know that these things are all interconnected: the climate crisis, economic inequality, democracy and having a strong democracy, racism and structural oppression. These things are all interconnected. So our solutions need to be thinking like that. We need to be thinking about the fact that we're all interdependent. All these systems are interdependent. That we need to make sure that people have access to democracy. How does economic justice fit into this? How do we build more regenerative solutions? Some of you may have seen this framework. This comes from the Climate Justice Alliance, which is, this is called the Just Transition Framework. And I'm not going to dive too deeply into it so that folks can look it up. But the whole idea is, how do we move from exploitation and extraction towards cooperation, democracy, regeneration, and doing that in a way that moves money and is working to build new and invest in the solutions we want. There's been a lot of really great climate justice work that has happened all across the Pacific Northwest. I feel like the Pacific Northwest has been a leader in a lot of this work, which is really great. I pulled some examples from Portland, from Seattle, from King County. Both Our People, Our Power, Our Planet report was a report that was actually driven by community. It was a community-based participatory research project. So communities of color in South Seattle got together and said, we want to put out what our community values, did all the research, did all the interviews, pulled together the report. And it was the first time that came out in 2016. It was the first time a lot of departments were like, oh, maybe we should think about health and housing being connected to climate change, because Up until that point, the debate has said, I don't see how housing's connected to climate change or displacement is. So this was like something that moved the narrative. I'm going to skip that. Oh, I guess I'll say something about this. This is also about pushing our decision makers, right? So this was pushing King County Metro and the public bus system of, as you move towards all electric buses, how can you implement those in the communities that will receive the most benefit first? And so this was start in South King County, where the air quality is worse, where the health outcomes are worse. And so it's not just about dealing with the impacts, but how can our mitigation solutions also be implemented in a way that are going to have impact, right? So that's why I put this one in here. It's about open space. I want to talk a little bit about, and can I go 4 more minutes? Is that okay? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about involvement and public involvement and who gets to be a part of these processes. So this is the county had used a framework of like community engagement continuum. Most decision makers often are on the first two. We will communicate out what we're doing, and it's usually just in English. And then if we're doing outreach, we'll do like a few public meetings where you can tell us what you're thinking, that are usually in the evening, only in English. You might be working during those times. And so it's about how do we actually access our decision makers, right? I think COVID has actually shifted a lot of things in being able to make the legislature in particular so much more accessible. You don't have to drive down to Olympia. All these virtual sessions allowed people to comment from all over the state. They saw, I think, like an 800% increase or something in participation. I was just hearing that from Representative Harris-Taylor the other day. And then how do we move towards actually co-developing solutions instead of just telling people what to do? So I'm going to move forward and talk about what I built at the county was I had come from working in community-based organizations, from working as a climate justice activist, and then moving into a system and working for King County for almost 5 years. Because I saw the opportunity to take a lot of what we've been doing and try to institutionalize that. And so I advocated for, and we got our own section within the new Strategic Climate Action Plan, entirely focused on climate justice and driven by a climate equity community task force that got to shape and identify the policy solutions. So these are the 8 different areas they came out with that were recognizing. The first section is really about recognizing like we need to have those that are most impacted as part of the leadership and decision making. Then recognizing not everyone has the capacity for that. So how do you build capacity? Invest in leadership development, invest in paying people for their times. That was number 2. Invest in youth programs and building that pipeline of leaders. 3 was looking at green jobs and green jobs access, removing barriers to employment, recognizing that economic justice is innately connected to this. Health and emergency preparedness, food access systems, knowing that food prices likely are going to go up with climate change, housing security, anti-displacement, finding stable housing, being able to afford housing, energy justice and utilities, being able to afford your bills, being able to access renewable energy and be able to be a part of those solutions. And then transportation access and equity, knowing that like this isn't even everything, right? These are the things that we were like, oh, those let us do this. And even then it wasn't always guaranteed. We got a lot of pushback on some of these. It's like, well, how is that actually connected to climate change? Can we put that in? I don't know. And recognizing that not just these issue areas, but how we go about it is just as important. So that's what the cross-cutting strategies are, is we need to do it in a way that's equitable, prioritizing language access, really trying to get at root causes and not just trying to put a Band-Aid on the situation. And equitable climate future is making sure that future opportunities people have access to. That was just one section. And then we also helped to inform the other 2 sections around mitigation and adaptation and co-develop solutions across some of these. This is just one example. I know there's a group on housing, and so I just put this in here really quickly of like recognizing that housing is directly connected. Housing security is directly connected to these issues. So I'll end with two stories. One really quick. I'm not going to go super in depth because the second story is the one I really want you all to hear, which is that even with COVID, one of the things that Puget Sound SAGE, which is a community-based organization in the Puget Sound region, was recognizing that rising energy prices mean that low-income communities are disproportionately cutting down on other necessities in order to pay for their bills, and seeing that that is innately tied to climate. And so with COVID, there was the moratorium on eviction prevention, but also a moratorium on past utility bills. And so this group pushed and lobbied, and then also wrote a report and interviewed and surveyed their community and put this forward, and was able to successfully have the moratorium extended this past year. The story I really want to highlight, though, especially for any younger folks on this call, is that the young people have a huge impact. And this is a story from not that long ago. This was in 2015. So back in 2014, when I was running this youth program and the CID, I would have youth that would come to my program and then afterwards ask me for change so that they could get home afterwards because they didn't have enough money for the bus. And in this case, Rainier Beach High School students got together, and they, at the time, Seattle Public Schools, didn't provide you a bus pass unless you lived more than 2 miles from the school, regardless of your situation. Didn't matter if you were low income, didn't matter if you lived 1.99 miles from the school, and every neighborhood kind of being like treated the same. Rainier Beach High School said, well, walking to school for us is not accessible. Not everyone has a parent that can drop them off. There's, walking through our neighborhood is not the same as walking through other neighborhoods. And they were saying, if you give us bus passes, then our attendance rates will go up, our grades will go up. This is one of the things that could have so many ripple effects to this. And this was a student-led campaign that went to teachers and then to the school board and to the city council. And they successfully got the funding to do a pilot project that was just for Rainier Beach High School, that was just for those on free and reduced lunch. And it got to the point where after that, they saw attendance rates go up. They saw grades go up. And it was so successful that after that, they were like, oh, maybe we expand this out a little bit. And then it became all kids on free and reduced lunch in the city of Seattle. And then there was more lobbying and arguments that like, well, if you ride public transit as a kid, you're more likely to ride public transit growing up. And so they got support from environmental groups and climate change groups. And now, as of this year, all Seattle Public School students, regardless of income, regardless of where you live, are all eligible for a free transit pass. And this was a student-led initiative, students, teenagers driving this. And so if you ever doubt that a few people can make an impact, you totally can. And decision makers especially it looks so bad if you say no to young people. So I feel like I told some of my interns, I was like, you actually have more power than I do in many cases, because you show up and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the next generation of constituents, I better listen. And it looks real bad when you don't. So use that, take that energy into all of your campaigns that I know you're working on. I'm going to skip the definitions, but if you want any of this information, happy to share it. And that's all I have to share today, but I'm really excited for you all to work on your campaigns. Thank you for letting me go a little bit over. I know it was a bit ambitious, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was wonderful. If everyone could give a quick round of applause. That was awesome. I know I learned so much, and I will definitely be distributing this recording to a bunch of people, and I will make sure that your contact information is distributed And so if anyone needs anything, they can reach out to you. But Jamie's going to stick around for our discussion after. So this is not the last you will be seeing of her. So we